This is the Lord of the Rings podcast on TV Podcast Industries. We're back talking about the Rings of Power for part 2 of our season 2 wrap-up.
It must be nearly noontide. One used to hear the kingfishers flying to the river. It is a pity how you have silenced them.
All I have done has been for you. Yours was the fire that crafted the marvels of the age. I wish only to share them with the world. Please, let me.
But the rings are beyond your reach, as I shall be ere long. For soon I shall go to the shores of the morning, borne hence by a wind that you can never follow.
Welcome back to our circle, fellow ringers. This is our Rings of Power podcast. We're talking about the second part of our season 2 wrap-up. I'm Derek, I'm one of your hosts.
Hello there, fellow ringers. I am one of your other hosts, John, and we are joined by our wonderful friends from Podcastica.
Hi, I'm another one of your hosts today, Anwin.
And I am rounding out the group. I'm Penny.
If you haven't heard part 1 of our chat all about the Rings of Power season 2, it's available over on podcastica.com on the Cast of the Rings feed. We chatted all about our favourite characters in season 2 in a pretty in-depth discussion.
Very in-depth, yeah. Yes. Really covering all the bases there of all the characters in season 2.
Absolutely. And as we said, we are delighted to be joined by our friends from over in Podcastica. Anwin, do you want to tell us a little bit about Cast of the Rings podcast?
Sure. Well, Penny and I have been podcasting on Cast of the Rings for just over 2 years. We started before the first season of The Rings of Power with a bit of lead up. We've covered season 1. Since then, we've covered the Lord of the Rings, the 3 Peter Jackson movies, and a couple of other bits and pieces. And just recently wrapped up season 2 as well, which we have really enjoyed. And we're part of the greater podcast family of podcastica.com. And we're just super excited to be here today and podcasting together with the two of you who are in our ears lots of the time.
It's so much fun. We've been listening to each other for the 2 years, and we've been chatting to each other. We know each other through Podcastica. Should say that because we're all Walking Dead fans and we all kind of met through that. But this is the first time we've all been podcasting together. So delightful to have us all chatting about the Rings of Power. On this episode, we're going to be discussing our favourite scenes, sequences of the season and some of our hopes for season 3. So I think we'll kick off with our favourite scenes and sequences or aspects. Anwin, do you want to kick us off with your favourite part of the season?
Sure. I actually really want to get started by talking about the lore. And I have just really loved that the showrunners have struck a great balance between making it easy to understand for the people who haven't read the books or seen the movies a million times like we have, and putting in little treasures for those who know the lore really well. I think that's not easy, and I think they've done a really good job of nailing that balance, with some small exceptions like stringing us along with who Gandalf is, but which we've already covered in the first half. But, you know, I've really enjoyed delving into the lore as each episode comes up as well. It's so much fun to remind myself of all the background information, getting into all of my copies of the books, putting in my little post-it notes and making notes in the margin. I have just finished reading the Silmarillion for the first time cover to cover. I have dipped in and out of it and read individual chapters many times over the years, but this was my first time going front to back, and it was really awesome. It was great to sort of read this alongside while watching the Rings of Power Season 2. some of the things that have been really interesting that I noted, one of the moments when Celebrimbor, right at the end, calls Sauron a shadow of Morgoth, that's directly from the Silmarillion, where Sauron is described as a shadow of Morgoth. Love that they threw that little tidbit in there for us. Another point was the elves at the Watchtower in season 1 being suspicious of men. There's a section in the Silmarillion during the War of Wrath where it's described, but a great part of the sons of men, whether of the people of Uldor or others new come out of the east, marched with the enemy, and the elves do not forget it. And I love that because, again, it shows that kind of depth of knowledge that the showrunners had and the writers had when they were talking about the suspicions, that the elves had for the men of the Southlands. We've got Círdan saying to Elrond, your father would be proud. He was a really good friend of Eärendil, and when you read the Silmarillion, you get to see some of that sort of stuff. And again, just a little line that's thrown in there. If you didn't know any of the background, you say, well, that's great, he knew his dad. But when you do know the background, it's really fun to read. After one of the great battles as well in the Silmarillion, we have a line that says, by the commander of Morgoth, the orcs with great labour gathered all the bodies of those who had fallen in the great battle, and all the harness and weapons, and piled them in a great mound in the midst of Ungfalith, and it was like a hill that could be seen from afar. And you remember in that scene in the sort of prologue section of the Rings of Power season 1, where we have that big pile of elf helmets, all these little visual things that made me realise the more I read into the background that the showrunners and the writers have got a huge amount of lore knowledge, and the fact that they were able to put so much in for the people that were looking for it, but still make it understandable for people who didn't. I think it was so well done.
Yeah.
And I think seeing some of the absolute classic pieces of lore that people familiar with the books know about, but that we haven't seen before on screen so much, was really special, especially this time around in season 2. So even though for me overall the most captivating parts to watch through the whole season were Numenor and the Celebrimbor Anatar series or sections, I actually really liked episode 4, and that episode had neither Numenor or Celebrimbor and Anatar, but it included 3 amazing pieces of Tolkien legend. You got Tom Bombadil, you got the Barrow Wights, and you've got the Ents. And to have all 3 of those that we haven't seen much or at all on screen before was so cool. Absolutely loved it. So, the lore for me this season has been extra special, and I've really enjoyed digging into that and exploring it.
Fantastic. And it's such an interesting thing because, of course, as we talked about before, the showrunners don't have the rights to the Silmarillion. They haven't been sold to them. The Tolkien estate keeps holding them, so understandably, but it must be a difficult balance for them getting that right and making sure that they are referencing things that they in books that they don't have the rights to, but are able to take little elements of it out with agreement of the Tolkien estate. So it is interesting catching those things that are specific lines from the book. You wonder if they did get the rights to Silmarillion, what extra would it add for them, really?
Yeah, because there's so much more there to explore. And I understand that they've been able to go back and ask on an individual basis for different things. So, for example, the name Anatar does not appear in the Lord of the Rings or the appendices, but they did get permission to use the name. So on a case by case, they're allowed to go back. And I'm hoping that as they gain the trust of the Tolkien estate more and more over these seasons, that they'll get more to play with as we progress through. So hopefully that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which I guess kind of leads on from the lore, is how is this portrayed to us? How do we get to see and hear this on screen? Because the other thing that I really enjoyed was the music and the visuals of this show. The music was by Bear McCreary, and he just did an incredible job with this. A huge amount of the screen time is scored. So often in TV, you have quite a lot of stuff that doesn't have any music in the background. A huge amount of this show is, and I think that you can tell this is done well because you don't often notice it. So the music can be noticeable if it's jarring or it doesn't mix or blend with or enhance with what you're seeing on screen. I think this did an incredible job with portraying and lending itself to the emotion of what was happening in every scene. And there's quite a few bits and pieces that you can find both on the official behind the scenes on Amazon, but also in interviews and so on with Bear McCreary. He seems like a really cool guy. He's like this kind of metalhead dude who's really into his classical music as well. And he said that he designed Sauron's music as somewhat kind of hero themed, so not always dark, because Sauron thinks he's the hero and the savior of Middle-earth. Another part that I noted was when Nori is talking to the Gund, the leader of the Stores. The music is really reminiscent of Howard Shore's Shire theme. It used similar instruments and even some of the same notes, which then just veer off into a different melody just when you think it's going to be the Shire theme. I thought that was masterful. It was really good.
Yeah, absolutely. He's just done such a wonderful job to pay kind of homage to Howard Shore. And Howard Shore does the actual theme tune for the show, which is absolutely beautiful as well. But he still seems to be so collaborative with the world of Lord of the Rings. Howard Shore really made his name off the back of the Peter Jackson movies. He still tours the world doing the score for Lord of the Rings, but he still seems so in love with that world. And it's almost like taking Bear McCreary under his arm and saying, this is a guide of how you should do it on the show. But Bear McCreary himself has developed so much as an artist and as a composer. We know him as the composer for Walking Dead, mentioning Walking Dead before, and he composed the theme tune to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. back in the day. But over the last 10-15 years, he's done such amazing scores for TV shows and games as well. He's done some great video game scores. But it's his work here is magnificent. It's another one of the things where I really want the appendices version of The Rings of Power, where we have an hour-long documentary of Bear McCreary sitting down talking about how he does the music with his orchestra, because he's fascinating. He is really interesting.
And because he's so joyful about it too. I love it that he's obviously just really into it. And then I think the music lends itself so well to the visuals in the same way that Bear McCreary took what Howard Shore did and then developed it and made it seem similar to be in the same world, but put his own spin on it as well. I think that the visual design did the same thing. I mean, first of all, it's just stunningly beautiful. You can just tell how much money was thrown in it. But also I think it was a great balance between making it look enough like Peter Jackson's version of the world that is really familiar to a lot of us, but also giving it a different look. So you had some of the choices that were the same as Peter Jackson. So, you've got, like, for example, the Scottish accents for the dwarves. You've got the design of the architecture for the dwarves, the elves. Numenor looking like early Gondor, and specific items like Narsil, which looks, the sword looks almost exactly the same. So we know we're in that world. It's exactly, the same choices for a lot of those things. But then you had these sort of differences as well, which I really enjoyed to distinguish it. So things like the elves overall, they sort of the look is more fresh and green. They use a lot more green and silver rather than later on it was more bronzes and yellows and oranges to make it look more towards the decline of their time in Middle-earth. The Harfoots, they're similar to the Hobbits in some ways, but a lot wilder. This reflects their kind of nomadic lifestyle. We recognize them, but they're different. Some of the elves having short hair. I loved the diversity where they used a lot of people of colour in every different race. And then tiny details like the dwarves' fingernails and fingertips being dusted with gold, noticeably Disa, but also later you actually see Durin the Elder has gold fingers as well when he's doing his mining. My only disappointment with the visuals was actually the elven rings themselves. Right. I did like that the dwarven rings looked kind of more chunky and earthy. But the elven ones they just looked a little bit cheap to me. They didn't look like they had the weight and the grandeur that I would kind of expect from them. But overall, everything else, I just, like you say, you could take a screenshot of almost any scene and print that and put it on your wall. It was just so beautiful to look at. I loved the landscapes. The first season was filmed in New Zealand, and of course I was very disappointed when they moved it and worried that it would look really different in season 2. But they did really well. I can understand the reasons for it. When they filmed Lord of the Rings over here, they did the initial production was about 14-15 months of filming. That was for all 3 films. But if you think about this, especially the main core actors, they're here in New Zealand for 8 months 5 times over 10 years. It's a really huge ask, and you can understand why they moved it. But, you know, there's some scenes in season 2 where I could tell they weren't New Zealand forests or landscapes, but most people wouldn't be able to tell that. And, you know, they've got some digital backgrounds with some second unit stuff that was filmed in New Zealand. And then obviously those extra kind of desert locations for Rune that would not have been easy to do in New Zealand. So overall loved it. And I just think that obviously we'll get into the acting and all the characters and things, but I think that the music and the visuals really just contributed so much to building that world to make it seem believable.
Absolutely. I know they talked about, relocating to the UK, but we were joking about it when we heard that it was going to be moving from New Zealand to the UK, that effectively the helicopter would just be constantly flying around New Zealand, capturing as much as they possibly could before they had to relocate, and just here's our bank of visuals that we'll use for the second season to the 5th season. But it's been fabulous. Yeah,
I think I kind of said I don't recall any deserts in England.
Yeah.
So
where is that being filmed? Yeah, absolutely. Great stuff. Anybody else on the music and visuals for the show?
Oh, the music's great.
I was going to say, as long as we're talking about visuals, I wanted to shout out to the costumes, because they are each a work of art in and of themselves. I have seen a lot of people online duplicating them for cosplay, and a lot of discussions of details, and a lot of close-up pictures of costume details. And I love that there's a whole fan base that is obsessed with the costumes, because I always get all geeky about costumes and all of these high production value shows, like the Game of Thrones and House of the Dragons. And they are elegant and also believable. I think what impresses me the most is the armor. I love the different armors and how they reflect the cultures of the different people wearing them, but also look like, usable armor that somebody would really wear.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's, the attention to detail is what's important about this. Like, every department knows what they're making and wants to do their best possible effort in there. Yeah,
absolutely. And the music for me is wonderful. Really have enjoyed it.
Even that metal song in episode 6.
Maybe that put.
That was awesome.
I love that.
Maybe. That was a little bit of a challenge for me, and it's not that I don't like metal music, but I just, I don't know fully whether that worked for me. But there we go. But I love the music for this show. It really paints that picture. It's just that layering of, I think, as we just discussed on this point, the lore, the visuals, the costumes, all of it just layers so well. And Ben McCreary is superb. Love his stuff.
Yeah. One of the things I really love about the music, and I kind of talked about it in part 1, about the essentials of what makes something a Tolkien story rather than a fantasy story. And one of the things that really does it for me is the poetry and the music of the main characters in the story. And that they've really brought that into the second season. We had Gil-galad sing a song in front of all of the elves. I thought that was really important to have him do that. Obviously, having Tom Bombadil with his old Tom Bombadil song, having Rory Kinnear sing that as well. I thought that was lovely to incorporate that into the show, because not many shows outside of musicals would do that. We've watched Agatha All Along do that for 8 episodes recently, so that's a musical at times, but in Lord of the Rings, I think it's essential to do that for the characters, just to add that little extra piece of Tolkienism to the show. I think that's your points, Anwen, is that? Yeah, so will we move on to Penny? Penny, what are your favourite scenes and sequences from the season?
I'm going to start with the Ents, because I am an Ent super fan. I love the Ents. And when we started this podcast, when Anwen and I started Cast of the Rings, 2 years ago at the beginning of Rings of Power, I was like, when are we going to get Ents? There should be Ents. We need Ents. And there's one shot in season 1 when everyone's watching the star, the shooting star that turns out to be Gandalf. And there's one of the, it's just a split second of what looks like 2 Ents watching the comet go across the sky. And I was like, I saw Ents. That means we're getting Ents. So I've been waiting and waiting. And so we finally got them this season. And They were everything I could have hoped for, and I couldn't have asked for better voice actors. And, getting to see an Ent wife and not just a male Ent was exciting for me. And I hope we get to see them again. I have a lot of hopes that they're going to come back because of that whole thing that Kemen says to Theo, where he's like, "Oh, you have to bring us trees. It's just trees, like whatever." I'm like, "Oh, that's an opportunity for Ents." I'm hoping.
And it's, Arondir making that specific promise to the Ents that he will save their trees, and then Kemen arriving with his villainous scowl going, cut trees out of the land, bring them in here, or you don't get any food. It's just that great villain term where you're going, oh, he doesn't know about the Ents in there. Maybe he should go out with his axe.
That's it. I loved all the side eye being given in that scene. Is like, what's he asking us to do?
They're not just trees, but okay. And speaking of seeing an Ent wife, I was a Lord of the Rings fan as a kid. I started with The Hobbit. My family had this like set of cassette tapes that was an old like BBC audio play of The Hobbit that we would listen to over and over and over again while we did jigsaw puzzles. It makes us seem like a really like cute family. But anyway, like with the fire going and the Christmas tree and puzzles and The Hobbit. And so I got the books and I read the books over and over and over again. And the one problem I always had with the stories and even into the Peter Jackson movies was there's just not very many women in these stories. Like, Éowyn is really the only female character that does anything, right? Galadriel is like this ethereal character in Lothlorien, and she helps them, but like she doesn't do much. Arwen is basically just a love interest, and you barely even see her. They beefed her up a little bit for the movies, but as a kid, I was always like, it's hard to see myself in this story, right? I love the story, I love the world of it, but there wasn't anyone for me to identify with. So in Rings of Power, I'm so excited to see not just Galadriel, but we've got Disa, and there was Bronwyn, and there's Miriel, and Nori, and Poppy. And then this season, we got more than one woman per race, which was one of my big complaints season 1. And they had names, and the elf women weren't all covered with veils. And it was very exciting for me. And, having characters of color, and I know there's been backlash against it, but those people are stupid. I feel like for the next couple of generations of young women coming up, it's exciting to have characters that you can project yourself onto in Middle Earth and be like, oh, maybe I would be like a Mirdania. I hope not, because that doesn't end well. But, or, a stone singer like Disa and, the other stone singers that she works with, or a healer like Bronwyn. There's all these options for women, or a Weasley turncoat like Eärien. Like, there's choices. I get really excited about this because growing up, even when there were women in the big fantasy stories like Star Wars, there was always only one, And so if you didn't fit that mold, it was kind of hard to see yourself in the stories. And it's changing, and it's wonderful. And I love seeing it in my Tolkien because that was sort of the last fandom where I wanted to see it happen from my childhood. One of my favorite scenes in the whole series so far is the goodbye scene between Celebrimbor and Galadriel, when he gives her the 9 rings and he tells her to save as many people as she can, and they have that conversation where he says, just remember that it's not strength that defeats darkness, it's light. And Anwen and I talked about this on our podcast. It's a sort of a paraphrase of Martin Luther King Jr. Speech where he said, hate cannot drive out hate, only light can do that, only love can drive out hate. And it's something that I have held on to for a lot of years through various times in the world where it seems like darkness is winning. And I, like anyone, I get angry, I feel hopeless, I feel despair when there is darkness in the world, but I try to remember to try to be the light. And to fight darkness and to fight hate with love and light. And I love that as a theme. And I can't wait to see how that plays out next season because it was such a big part of the finale moment. So I think it's a beautiful way to face the darkness in the world, is to try to fight it back with love instead of with more violence.
Absolutely. And I think as we've said, one of the strengths in Rings of the Power is them taking that Tolkien theme, that hopeful Tolkien theme, and that's really this is really a line that encapsulates that here. Just like his message about the smallest people can be the biggest heroes of the entire Middle Earth with the hobbits. This message of being the light in the darkness, and stopping hate by doing that is a really strong message, and really strong Tolkien-like message. Definitely, yeah. Great points there, Penny. John, I think we've come to the end of Penny's points. Do you want to pick up on your favourite scenes from?
Yeah, absolutely. Mine are definitely scenes in the main. I'm going to kick off with the Barrow-wights. I just actually loved these being sort of realised. The one thing that I always remember sort of, I think seeing an interview with Tolkien from some kind of archive footage of the BBC was him talking about how, Norse mythology, all Celtic mythology, all these different kind of cultures, myths, lore, and also just at least the modern day sort of absence of them in England, even though you would have it there from the Saxons and the and so on, and the Celtic times as well. But the absence of it fading, and this was a way of reconnecting that and almost sort of developing a mythology. Well, actually developing a mythology. So I all like that, and I think the Barrow-wights for me really just speak to that. Something based around sort of Norse concepts, but Barrow, very common term for towns and places in where I was brought up, being sort of those burial mounds, and the wights being sort of an Old English term. And so seeing these realised, that kind of is just so good. The chant as well that you have, and I mean in particular for the actual scenes here, just love how the chant sort of floats on the air as the Barrow-wights themselves do. And I just really love this scene. It plays to my love of horror. It plays to just the ethereal sort of nature of sort of wights being this other sentient kind of being or person. And so I just absolutely love this scene. Effectively the group racing to get to Eregion, but being sort of caught in this absolute sort of nightmare situation with these Barrow-wights. So absolutely loved it.
It's interesting what you say about the Barrows being a real part of the history and the landscape of where you're from, John. I'm from New Zealand, and we've only had people here for about 900 years, and we've only had sort of buildings for the last 200. And so it's quite amazing. I've spent a lot of time in England as well. I lived there for a year in the north, and to see that as part of the real history and the real kind of archaeology and, of that landscape is really interesting, and knowing Tolkien's from there as well. To see this on screen as something that's been realised from this fantasy world was really incredible as well. And I loved the visuals of it. We've seen skeletons before on screen. We've seen ghosts before in 100 different movies. But to see the combination of the two, of these spirits animating these dead bodies, and the way that they did it with them kind of almost, they almost kind of looked like little kinetic kind of models, kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but the way they kind of sectioned themselves back into their shape after they had been taken out was incredible to see, and so creepy. I think they really captured that feeling that you get, because I do think that in the book, when you read the Barrow-wight section with Frodo and the hobbits going and being captured by the Barrow-wights, it was absolutely chilling, and one of the scariest parts of a book that I've read, actually. And so to see that translated in the screen with elves instead of hobbits was really incredible. I really loved that.
Yeah, it was really good. It was really good. And it was almost like they were able to revisit the concept that they used in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings with the Dead Army, the Rising of the Dead Army. It's like they had the ability to re look at that style and that concept of the ghostly skeleton figures. Because I remember at the time, I don't know whether you guys remember this, when that came out in Return of the King, about 2 months later, the Pirates of the Caribbean came out, I think. So it was like as if they'd copied the idea from the other movie, and it wasn't as impressive as it would have been if we hadn't had Pirates of the Caribbean doing a very similar thing within the same summer, or within the same year. But yeah, really great scene. Any other big moments, John?
Well, I was just going to as well say, interestingly, sort of, I think Tolkien taught or went to school not very close to where I was born, but up, I think, in the Ribble Valley. There's a big public school up there. I can't remember its name, where I think he has some connection to that, whether he taught there briefly or he actually went to boarding school there, because I know he's from Birmingham. So, but it's kind of really interesting because that whole area is very
beautiful.
Sort of like there's, it goes back to Roman, but there's lots of lore around witches and so on, all in that area around Pendle Hill and so on. So like it's very kind of interesting, sort of, and that's, I think, with the Barrow-wites, really,
very inspiring kind of area to be in as well.
And then I kind of go to Numenor, really. Again, I just loved the visual of Miriel's trial by the Valar through this sea monster. I just thought the setting of it was fantastic. I love the fact that it really just, scuppered Pharazôn's plans for, however briefly. It kind of put a big grin on my face that Miriel and Elendil felt like they were kind of maybe slightly back in the ascendancy there on Numenor, however brief it was. I just loved this whole setting. I loved how it played to that politics that was playing out in Numenor in this season. I loved how it almost seemed to go counter to what Pharazôn was trying to do as well, in terms of sort of looking back to this kind of the trial by the Valar, this older custom. We hear of him wanting to knock down temples in order to build aqueducts, whether it's like motorways slicing through communities or whatever, I kind of really enjoyed this, and I think the visual of it was superb. And
it did have that, we talked about it again, I think, at the time. It did have that Salem witch trial idea, if she's not a witch, she'll drown and then she'll have a good life afterwards, and that's kind of what it felt like here. She'll go by the trial of this ancient thing that we don't believe in, and she'll definitely die proving that we were right all along, kind of.
Exactly. But it's also the stoicism of Muriel here as well. So I really enjoyed this, and ultimately, she is found to be innocent in this instance as she survives the trial, and I just really enjoyed it, and I think, sticking with Numenor, I actually really enjoyed how they did the treatment of the Palantir with Pharazôn, where it kind of almost explodes out into reality. I thought that was a really nice way of, instead of kind of touching it and crystal balling it and going into it, it's almost as though this vision sort of explodes around Pharazôn when he touches it, and it's immersing his immediate reality in what could be, and also just the different visions depending on who is touching the Palantir as well that comes from this season. It is really, really good.
So absolutely. I love that it kind of had that the interpretation side of it. I think it's a Harry Potter thing as well, isn't it? Where they see their vision and whatever way they interpret it can completely change how they deal with the world around them. So when we see Arondir seeing his vision of him leaving Numenor behind, and he believes that's not in the plan for him.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Exactly what
Farazon saw sexy Halbrand.
He did.
So
He did.
don't know what Farazon's going to do with that, but it might secure his position, however briefly. But I mean, even just that immediate scene, it's just, you see Halbrand, with Annatar and Sauron, and you go, it's just that trepidation for what's to come. It's just a nice little touch, I think, in terms of how they use that. And I think the other really nice touch, which I never thought I would see at all, was the use of Morgoth's crown as basically a weapon, as Annatar is dueling with Galadriel. I just thought it was really great idea.
Fabulous.
Given how pointy it is. Why wouldn't you? I mean, it was just a real nice sort of use of it.
Yeah.
Given it's Morgoth's crown, you can it should be used for violence almost, you think. So I thought it was a really nice touch.
I loved that Morgoth's crown as well. And I also think it's quite cool when the showrunners and writers put in a little kind of disclaimer to the people who know the lore. So back in the day when Morgoth was defeated, they actually melted down his crown into a collar for him and to restrain him. And I love how in this season they said there are many tales of what happened to Morgoth's crown, so that they're kind of basically paying tribute to the people that know, hang on, that became a collar. This is another tale. This is what we see we say is happening. And I love that they made it still sort of look like a crown that could have been of Morgoth, but it also looks very similar to the sort of Peter Jackson version of the Sauron crown that we see later.
Absolutely.
Which was really, really cool. I loved it. And the way that he used it in that battle with Galadriel and kind of grabbed her sword and twisted it. And it was really great.
Fabulous. Again, you can see the stunt people and the stunt actors and the performance behind the scenes for months working out every movement of that fight between the two of them, because it had to be epic. It had to be their big fight between each other. I know we talked about whether we'll see the two of them have much connection in the next couple of seasons, but when you have this moment where it's the two of them facing off, and Galadriel has to be a very powerful character facing off against Sauron, and Sauron has to now show his true self to her. I thought it really had so much in it that it wasn't just a fight. I thought it kind of added so much to their lore together as characters.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're my points. Just really, I guess it speaks to Anwen's points around the visuals. That some of them are just really, they're really striking.
Absolutely.
So
yeah. I'm choosing one of my favourite visuals from the season, and it's the opening of the season. The murder and rebirth of Sauron at the start of the season. I thought it just set up that we are looking at something different this time. We talked about it on our other part of our podcast, where we had said that the first season was the lore setting. It was setting up the characters, establishing the world, and this season was telling us all about Sauron. And how you do that is you skip all the way back to when he was murdered by the people that he thought was going to be the army that would win him Middle-earth. I thought it was so interesting to have another actor playing the role for just that scene. Having him turned on by the orcs who believe that he's again going to use them as his army and going to kill them, and just like Morgoth did. But to have him fight off a few of them who are starting to attack, I thought was an interesting choice, until we see them all take him out. Adar take him with the first stab to the back, and then all of the orcs taking him out, effectively saying, this is not the person that we're going to have as our leader. And then we had the awesome oily trail of Sauron blood reforming into this creature that kills the rats to get its power back, and then climbing into the back of that cart. I just thought that felt so like Venom from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This creature that's going out trying to find its host almost.
Yeah.
It was cool.
Absolutely. I mean, I know it didn't look like it. I also had the thing going around, literally my head again. I like it when, in a sense, a non-horror property
Mm-hmm.
absolutely pulls on the horror genre to some extent, but also just the inherent horror of what they're dealing with, which is Sauron.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just really enjoyed this.
Yeah, absolutely, and it just leading into this new Sauron, this Halbrand character, and him being at his lowest, and then as we talked about before, him making his choices as he gets to the point where we see him in the series. But I think doing that as a flashback was such a great choice, and also creepy as hell, which works really well for me. And then my other big moment, a big sequence from the series is the rise of Adar. We see it there in that sequence when he's the one that stands up against Sauron, but his rise and fall throughout the season was fantastic. We talked more about the characters in the last episode, so really the mirroring of what happened to Sauron happening to Adar at the end of the season, I thought was a great way to say goodbye to the character. Really sad, really affecting, because I did think he became a featured character for us this season. Last season he was a villain. I loved the actor that played him, and I loved what they did with him last season. But this season, I felt like he was up there and could have been the leader of the opposition to Sauron in some senses, and have his own people turn on him when he had offered them so much and had wanted them to have their own civilization, which is something that they felt Sauron didn't offer them. At his fall, really coming from him trying to send them all in to take out Eregion, no matter what the cost. I thought that was a really sad storyline, but I loved that it echoed what happened to Sauron. It was getting too big for his boots almost. Any other favorite scenes? Anything else that anybody else wants to throw out about the season that we haven't discussed? There's lots there.
I mean, we could go all night.
We could.
A faithful sort of retelling of just the series.
Of the whole series. Absolutely.
I do think it's interesting. You said borrowing horror elements from, into a non-horror genre, but there's a lot of horror elements in Tolkien. There's a lot of monsters and creepiness and the Barrow Wights, like Anwen was talking about in the book. I mean, that's a really horror scene. And the Balrogs are sort of larger than life horror, but some of the other Tolkien monsters, like Shelob, that's some Stephen King kind of horror there.
Oh, definitely. And I think sort of with Peter Jackson as well, directing with his own horror sensibility is just absolutely perfect for it. I mean, I think it's just traditionally, parents wouldn't necessarily, given The Hobbit at 12 years old, and it's not talked about in that horror genre space. And it's that, but you're absolutely right. It has that threaded through it. Yeah. And in some ways, you could see Peter Jackson, like what he would pull out from his horror leanings, in particular around Shelob, really good. And actually, we kind of have a mini Shelob moment this season as well.
Isildur being saved by his wonderful horse Beric, rhyming with my name, from the lair of Shelob. But it's a younger Shelob.
I think it's meant to be Shelob's parent, right?
Yeah.
Or like the baby spiders might be Shelob. What do you think, Anwen?
I read an interview where they confirmed that they said it was baby Shelob, because Shelob's been around for thousands of years. So it was one of their cute little kind of inserts that they put in there.
Fantastic.
For sure.
Fantastic.
And I mean, if you want to explore some horror, I do recommend reading the Silmarillion. You've got werewolves, you've got vampires, you've got hands being cut off, you've got all kinds of horrible things between creatures and other creatures. And Tolkien could get pretty dark when he wanted, that's for sure.
Yeah. There you go. That's what I'm getting you for Christmas, John. Excellent stuff. We'll close out our favourite scenes from season 2 and go on to one other topic for this. Some hopes for season 3. I think we'll start with Penny. Penny, what's your hope for season 3? Is it a big hope for season 3?
I have several small hopes and one really big hope. Okay. So the small hopes are just more women that have names and stuff to do that aren't just set dressing.
Doesn't seem like a big ask.
No, but Elendil and Isildur reunion. It breaks my heart that Elendil doesn't know that his son survived. I want someone to slap Kemen across the face. He just has it coming.
We'll all do it, I think.
Yeah, everybody should just line up and just like slap.
Absolutely. Like that scene from Airplane where it gets progressively worse as people are lining up to slap.
Yes, exactly. That would make me so happy. You know what? Actually, he could do that as a fundraiser. Like, people would pay good money to slap him to raise money for a charity. And then my really big hope is I want to see Elrond found Rivendell. Rivendell is my favorite fictional location. It's where I wish I could go. It's one of my favorite places that's ever been created by any author ever, and I would love to see it coming into being.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the location we saw right at the end of season 2. So hopefully that means it will be founded and we will see it being built.
I must say I love Rivendell as well. My only issue is I used to work for a consultancy that was called
no.
Yes.
They were massive Lord of the Rings fans as well. So they called their company Rivendell Consulting, which was just the weirdest thing ever.
That's the worst.
Exactly. It was just kind of bizarre, but anyway.
But you could tell everybody you worked in Rivendell and make it sound really
I actually
nice.
worked in Rivendell. So I actually worked in Rivendell.
It just doesn't sound peaceful.
Lord Elrond was an absolute arse. I mean, my manager wasn't.
Fantastic. Great thoughts there, Penny. Yeah, I think most of those are doable. We're definitely going to see that Elendil and Isildur reunion. It's interesting. It's interesting thinking that so much happened in Numenor because he didn't know that Isildur was alive, or nobody knew that Isildur was alive. If they had known, there's so much that wouldn't have gone on in Numenor. How interesting. Brilliant stuff. John, how about yourself? What are you looking forward to in season 3?
Men. 9 men, in fact. I kind of really want to get up close and personal with the future Ringwraith. As I say, I mean, there's such striking images, whether it's on the page or whether it's through, the drawings, or whether it's through Peter Jackson's movies. They're so creepy. They're so ethereal, and I want to know, who these 9 kings of men were, and because as well, just the landscape that the writers have drawn so far, at least for the kingdoms of men on Middle Earth, it seems quite peasanty, in a sense. It's not got the grandness of Numenor, although I do wonder, will Pharazôn be something? I don't know. I mean, I don't really know enough about necessarily the origins of the Ringwraiths, other than they formed because of the 9 rings, the kings of men. But at the moment, I don't really get the sense of many kings of men in this world. So I'm hoping that we get to start to glimpse that. I mean, the one king from the Southlands is an imposter.
Well, yeah, exactly.
He's a deathly angel that's come down and has been tormenting Celebrimbor. So it's really just Numenor at the moment that has that feel for it. So yeah, I kind of want to. I mean, it'd be a bit pedantic, but I would love for them just 9 episodes, 9 different kings of the stories, So it'd be really, really good just to find out about who they were.
Right.
And I think certainly the Witch King of Angmar, that would be a good one to focus on.
Yes.
For sure.
I'm just so intrigued. Yeah, I wonder, have we met any of the kings of men yet? Somewhere in the background, and they grow up to be the king, one of the kings of men who gets a ring. I'm not sure. I'm really intrigued, but it is going to be a big story, right? For the rest of the show, is who gets these 9 rings, and knowing that Sauron is the one that's making the choice because he has the 9 rings. But I love the idea of the Rings of Power season 3, ring 1. as episode 1, and then episode 2 will be just called Ring 2, like that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that as well, John. I think getting to see who the future ring wraiths are going to be is incredible. But we can widen our gaze from kings. So in the Lord of the Rings movies, they gave Aragorn the line that these were great kings of men. That's not the case from the book. They weren't all
Very
kings.
good.
Some of them were warriors, some were sorcerers, some were great noble men, but they weren't all kings. So we don't have to look for kings in this instance. And in the Ring rhyme as well, they are just 9 for mortal men. So we do know that 3 of them are Númenóreans. Hope that's not too spoilery for people, but apparently 3 of the 9 were from Númenor. So we can kind of have a look, I guess, and see which of the characters that we've maybe seen so far could end up being one. I kind of think that the Lord Belzegar is definitely an option. And yeah, getting to see where the rest of them come from would be cool. And just that journey, because we only see them, right, as these faceless kind of black cloaked creatures. It'd be really cool to see them get the rings, start to descend into madness and so on. It happened over hundreds and hundreds of years, but of course we'll probably see it speed up again like we are with most of the season. But yeah, that's definitely going to be exciting to see.
Absolutely. I wonder if they'll just start doing time jumps to match the timelines. At some point, we'll just suddenly go, okay, we just skipped 50 years over the course of this episode or something, you know. But yeah, no, that'll be fascinating to see. We're really looking forward to that. Anwen, how about yourself? What are your hopes for season 3?
Well, I am also, as you know, I love Númenor, and I'm really intrigued to see Númenor continuing its descent into its final fate. And part of that is as well, I agree with you, Penny, Elendil and Isildur reuniting. It might not happen right away because Elendil's, you know, he's swanned off to the other side of the island, and I think we're going to see Isildur eventually go back to the main city and see what chaos has happened there, and then he'll probably, I guess, join him and his brother across the other side for whatever they're going to do. But that reunion will be beautiful, and just seeing the general decline of Númenor and what happens next is going to be really fascinating to me. Again, just having read the Silmarillion, and there's a big chapter in there called the Akallabeth, which is the downfall of Númenor, and I can't wait to see how they translate that to screen. And as you say, Derek, with the time factor, what are we going to see in which season? We don't know, but definitely that's something that I'm looking forward to. And then I'm also looking forward to the possibility of another third branch of hobbits coming in. Maybe we'll get to see the Fellowhides and see how they are portrayed differently from the Harfoots in the stores, and then how they all end up together creating the Shire. So that's something else that I don't know if we'll see in this season, but I am looking forward to seeing for sure.
Fantastic. Totally agree with those as well. I'm choosing just a very simple one. They have to be able to do this. No more characters without a name, okay? We want the Dark Wizard to be named in episode 1 of the next season. He's going to have a name, and then we can just call him by his name, right? There's no other hidden characters. We don't know their names. Yeah. Everybody has to be called something, right? From now on. That's all I want.
Yeah, it's going to be Frank the Dark Wizard.
I chose this name the minute I came to Middle Earth. It's Frank, yes.
Call 0869 567 for all your odd job needs.
Very good. But I think what I really mean by that is I'm actually quite trusting in the showrunners for this show, particularly after the second season. I've been really enjoying it. So the story that they have to tell for the third season is what I'm really excited for to happen in the third season. But as I say, I just want that little thing that they've been doing for 2 seasons just out of this. It's not working. You tried it twice with Sauron and with Gandalf. It didn't work. Stop trying to hide people's names. It's not a fundamental of the show. So there you go. That's my hope for season 3. And that's our thoughts on Rings of Power season 2 for the second part. But we do have some feedback in from our lovely TV podcast industry's listeners. Penny, do you want to take the first piece of feedback?
Sure. This is from Coffee and Vodka, who I feel like I know because I've been hearing Coffee and Vodka's feedback on your podcast for so long.
So many years. He's fabulous.
He gave us his thoughts on season 2. He says, "Greetings, fellow Dark Days defenders. Kind of amazing how the Rings of Power and the boys told us in no uncertain terms what to expect. Suppose it all comes down to how much of an imprint a show makes, and this season did just that. My only concern is the pacing of the seasons. With 3 more to go, they might want to slow it down before they end up lapping the middle age. All in all, $1 billion success with my MVP a tie between Charlie Vickers as Sauron and Sofia Nomvetti's Disa. 4.5 self-tossed dwarves, temporary fatal wounds, and predictive fictions out of 5. Peace and take care, coffee and vodka.
Fantastic. Always great with his scorings there for from Coffee Vodka.
We also got a message from Felipe Florencio who says, "Hello, Melons. I really enjoyed Rings of Power Season 2. I felt the focus on fewer different groups of characters each episode made me connect with them more. I get why hardcore fans might not like the lore changes, but I see it as the creators' unique take, given the rights they were able to purchase. That said, I'm still not fully convinced about Numenor. It's where my interest dips a bit, although Elendil, the father of Isildur, right, is a great character, and I know the storyline will play a bigger role later on. I wish Arondir had more screen time, and I found Disa's discovery of the Balrog a bit too slapstick, almost Trapalhos style, the Three Stooges, or Laurel and Hardy for non-Brazilian listeners. On the other hand, I loved the Elven storyline. Galadriel and Elrond now have 2 faces when I think about them, which is amazing given they were previously portrayed by household names such as Cate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving. The Eregion plotline with Celebrimbor and the Making of the Rings was fantastic. The Durin's arc was also great, especially the depth of Prince Durin's character and the conflict between his loyalty to his father and his friendship with Elrond. Overall, I'd give this season 4 hold the doors, hold the door, hold door, Gandalf out of 5.
Fantastic, Felipe.
Excellent, Felipe. Yeah, that's given me a good old chuckle. Yeah, that'll tickle me for the next week.
I think so. Thanks so much for your feedback. Thanks to everybody that has been sending in your feedback across the course of our Rings of Power Season 2 discussion. We will be back, of course, for Rings of Power Season 3. And we on TV Podcast Industries are currently covering The Penguin. We've got one more episode to go of the DC show, The Penguin, which has been, honestly, top tier TV show. HBO have done it again. It has been absolutely excellent. So come on and join us over on TV Podcast Industries for our coverage of that. And once again, a huge thank you to Amon and Penny from the Cast of the Rings for joining us. What's next for you guys?
Well, next up on Cast of the Rings, we're going to be covering the War of the Rohirrim movie that's coming out just before Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to be covering the Hobbit movies as well, and we've got a couple of other little treats in store just over the next couple of months. So that's from the Cast of the Rings side. Penny as well has got an enormous amount going on with the podcasts on her other podcast feeds. Tell us about it, Penny.
So we're about to wrap up our coverage of the excellent Agatha All Along. And I am looking forward to finishing that up and then getting back to still slaying a Buffyverse podcast. And we will be picking back up with season 4 of Buffy and season 1 of Angel. And we're going to go back and forth between the 2 shows. And that's going to be a whole lot of fun. And then further down the line, at some point, Yellow Jackets comes back. And I'll be back on the Yellow Jackets WTF podcast with Podcastica.
Fantastic. That is still one of my favorite named Podcastica shows. Yellow Jackets, WTF, because you never know what's going to happen on that show.
It's a very WTF
Excellent.
show. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. All those podcasts can be found over on podcastica.com. You can also find our Good Omens podcast over there, can't you?
Yeah.
You
can.
Thanks once again, everybody, for joining us. If you didn't listen to part 1 of the podcast, make sure you go over to podcastica.com and catch part 1 as well. But that's it for our chat about the Rings of Power Season 2. What an epic chat it was.
Yeah, no, thanks to everyone for joining us, of course. And again, it's great to have Unwin and Penny involved with this part 2 or part 2. Yeah, really good to have your thoughts, and it's been great chatting to you about the Rings of Power. But fellow ringers, until next time, keep watching, keep listening, and of course, don't stray too far from the path. The Barrow-wites might get you.
Bye.
Nobody goes off trail. Nobody
walks alone.